In the spring of 1847, along the Oregon Trail near Fort Laramie, in what would become Wyoming Territory, a German-born wagon master named Heinrich Adler became the laughingstock of the entire wagon train when he announced his unconventional shelter design. While 43 families prepared their traditional canvas tents and wagon covers for the journey ahead, Adler spent 4 full days constructing what the other pioneers mockingly called the Fool's House of Sheets. Dicht. The seasoned trail veterans, men like Thomas Breckenridge, who had made the crossing twice before, openly ridiculed Adler's design as a waste of precious canvas and rope. What none of them could have predicted was that within 8 weeks, during a freak ice storm in late June that would claim the lives of 17 pioneers on other trains, Adler's ridiculed shelter would become the only thing standing between 18 families and death by exposure. Heinrich Adler had arrived in America from Bavaria in 1843 with his wife Martha and their 3 children, bringing with him 12 years of experience as a sailmaker in Hamburg. He'd worked on merchant vessels crossing the North Atlantic, where he'd learned firsthand how layered canvas could create insulation against brutal winds and freezing spray. When he joined the Donna Reed wagon train as a paid wagon master at Independence, Missouri, he brought 60 yards of heavy-grade sailcloth he'd purchased with his life savings, triple what any other family carried. The other pioneers couldn't understand why a man would burden his wagon with so much extra canvas when everyone knew you needed space for food, tools, and seed for the new homestead. Adler's camp was positioned in the middle of the train's night circle, exactly 112 feet from the Breckenridge wagon to the east, and 98 feet from the Morrison family to the west. In normal conditions, families would simply drape their 12 by 14-foot canvas sheets over their wagons or prop them on poles to create basic lean-tos that offered minimal protection from rain. These traditional setups could be assembled in 20 minutes, but provided almost no insulation, and when temperatures dropped below 45 degrees Fahrenheit, families would huddle in their wagons, burning whatever fuel they could spare. Adler had observed something crucial during his years at sea. He'd noticed that the gap between the ship's outer canvas weathercloths and the inner cabin walls always maintained warmth far better than single-layer coverage, and he'd seen how sailors who wore layered clothing survived North Atlantic crossings, while those in single heavy coats often succumbed to hypothermia. When he tried to explain this principle to the other pioneers, showing them his sketches of a multi-layered shelter with precise air gaps, they dismissed him as an eccentric foreigner who didn't understand frontier practicality. Historical records from the 1840s show that wagon train families typically consumed between 8 and 12 pounds of firewood per night to maintain minimal comfort in their canvas shelters when temperatures dropped into the 40s. Traditional tent designs of the period were essentially single sheets of canvas propped at angles, offering protection from precipitation, but virtually no thermal retention. The fundamental flaw was simple. Canvas is porous, wind passes through it, and without insulation, body heat escapes as quickly as it's generated. Adler had spent the winter months in Independence studying the problem, calculating that if he could create dead airspace between canvas layers, the inner layer would retain the heat from even a small fire, while the outer layer would break the wind. When he presented his idea to the Wagon Train Council, suggesting that his design could reduce firewood consumption by 60%, the response was unanimous skepticism. One council member, Jacob Morrison, told him directly that a man who makes his living with needle and thread might know ships, but he don't know the prairie. Adler made his decision on April 23, 1847, the day before the train departed Independence. He would build his shelter system regardless of the ridicule, because he had 3 children, and he'd seen too many sailors die from cold that could have been prevented. If you value the preservation of frontier ingenuity and the forgotten survival techniques that built this nation, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. These stories of practical wisdom from America's pioneers deserve to be remembered and shared. Your engagement helps ensure that the innovative spirit of people like Heinrich Adler continues to inspire future generations. Drop a comment if you've heard similar stories of unconventional techniques that saved lives on the frontier. Now, let's continue with how Adler transformed mockery into a system that would prove itself under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Adler began construction on April 29, 1847, during the train's 3rd camp after crossing into Kansas Territory. His design required 42 yards of his sailcloth, which he cut into 6 panels of precisely measured dimensions. 4 outer panels, each measuring 9 feet by 12 feet, and 2 roof panels measuring 8 feet by 14 feet. He started by driving 8 oak stakes, each 31 inches tall, into the ground in a rectangular pattern measuring 12 feet by 16 feet. The stakes were positioned in pairs, with exactly 18 inches between each pair, a specific gap he'd calculated based on his sail-making experience to create optimal air circulation without heat loss. For the inner structure, he used lighter cotton canvas in 4 panels, each measuring 8 feet by 11 feet, suspended from a framework of willow branches he'd cut from a creek bed 2 miles from camp. The entire framework took him 6 days to complete, working alone for 5 to 7 hours each evening after the day's travel. He transported the pre-cut panels in his wagon and assembled them fresh at each new camp, a process that initially took him 90 minutes, but would eventually be reduced to 35 minutes once he perfected the system. The physical labor was substantial. Each oak stake had to be driven 18 inches into soil that varied from soft prairie loam to clay hardpan, requiring an 8-pound maul and precise positioning to ensure the structure remained level. The willow framework required 43 individual branches, each carefully selected for flexibility and strength, stripped of bark, and lashed together with hemp rope at 26 connection points. Adler used a technique from ship-rigging called the constrictor knot at each junction, which tightened under load and could be released quickly when it was time to pack up and move. The outer canvas was attached to the oak stakes, using brass grommets he'd installed himself, spaced every 8 inches along the edges of each panel. Between the inner and outer canvas layers, he maintained a consistent air gap of exactly 9 inches, measured and verified at 12 points around the perimeter each time he set up the structure. This gap was critical, too narrow, and convection would transfer heat through the airspace too quickly. Too wide, and the air would circulate, again defeating the insulation effect. 9 inches was the precise distance Adler had calculated would create what we now call a dead air space, where air movement is minimal and thermal transfer is dramatically reduced. As construction progressed through early May, the reaction from the wagon train community intensified. Thomas Breckenridge was the most vocal critic, telling anyone who would listen that Adler was building a barn when a blanket would do. Zur. Sarah Morrison, Jacob's wife, commented that the German is wasting good canvas that could be trade goods in Oregon. Children from other families would gather to watch Adler work, their parents calling them away, as if proximity to such foolishness might be contagious. The specific phrase that would echo through the camp was coined by a blacksmith named Robert Chen. A tent inside a tent, like wearing two coats in summer. The mockery was rooted in the wagon train culture's deep suspicion of anything that deviated from proven methods. These were people whose survival depended on communal knowledge passed down through previous crossings. Innovation was viewed not as progress, but as dangerous experimentation that put the entire train at risk. Adler understood this, but persisted because his experience had taught him something these prairie pioneers hadn't yet learned. The ocean doesn't care about tradition, and neither does a Wyoming winter storm. By May 18th, Adler had completed his shelter system. The final structure stood 7 feet tall at its peak, with sloped sides that allowed rain and snow to shed naturally. The total material investment included 42 yards of heavy sailcloth, 23 yards of lighter cotton canvas, 8 oak stakes, 43 willow branches, 118 feet of hemp rope, and 64 brass grommets. The construction time across multiple camps totaled approximately 37 hours. The structure weighed an additional 43 pounds when packed, a significant burden on a wagon already loaded with 700 pounds of supplies. But Adler had calculated this was sustainable for his team of 4 oxen. The first real test came during a rainstorm on May 22nd, when temperatures dropped to 41 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Inside Adler's double-layer shelter, with a small fire burning in a portable iron stove he'd fabricated from ship's scrap metal, the interior temperature measured 68 degrees at chest height, verified with a mercury thermometer Adler had brought from Hamburg. He burned exactly 4 pounds of buffalo chips that night, fuel he collected during the day's travel. In the Morrison camp next door, the family huddled under their traditional single-layer canvas, draped over their wagon, burning 11 pounds of the same fuel to maintain an interior temperature of 53 degrees. The Morrison children shivered through the night, while Adler's 3 children slept comfortably in their wool blankets. The next morning, Jacob Morrison examined Adler's setup closely for the first time, running his hand along the outer canvas and feeling the warmth radiating from the inner layer. He didn't apologize for his earlier mockery, but he did ask how much canvas Adler had used. When Adler told him, Morrison shook his head and walked away, still convinced the extra weight and complexity weren't worth the marginal improvement. This initial success did little to change opinions in the broader wagon train community. The prevailing attitude was that 41 degrees wasn't truly cold, and when real frontier winter arrived, all the fancy German engineering wouldn't matter anyway. Several families began referring to Adler's shelter as the hotel, a term dripping with sarcasm that implied he was soft and unsuited for the hardships ahead. What none of them yet understood was the fundamental physics that made Adler's design superior. The principle behind Adler's double-layer shelter is based on thermal insulation through trapped air, the same concept that makes modern double-pane windows and insulated clothing effective. Heat transfers through 3 mechanisms: conduction, where heat moves through solid materials; convection, where heat is carried by moving air or liquid; and radiation, where heat travels as electromagnetic waves. A single layer of canvas is terrible at preventing all 3 types of heat loss. Conduction occurs through the canvas fibers themselves. Convection happens as wind pushes air through the porous weave, and radiation escapes directly through the material. By creating a 9-inch air gap between 2 canvas layers, Adler had addressed all 3 mechanisms simultaneously. The outer canvas blocked wind completely, eliminating convective heat loss. The air gap, when maintained at the precise width where natural convection currents couldn't form, minimized conduction between layers. This dead air space acted like a blanket, not because air itself is a good insulator, but because still air prevents heat from escaping through convection. The inner canvas then trapped radiant heat from the fire and human bodies, reflecting it back into the living space, rather than allowing it to escape outward. Modern thermal engineering would describe Adler's shelter as having an R value of approximately 3.2, compared to the R value of 0.8 for a single canvas layer. This meant his shelter was 4 times more effective at retaining heat than traditional wagon train tents. Adler didn't know these terms or calculations. What he knew was that on ships, sailors who slept between bulkheads survived, while those who slept against single-wall cabins often didn't. He'd observed, he'd remembered, and he'd applied that observation to a completely different environment. This is the essence of practical intelligence, the ability to recognize universal principles and adapt them to new challenges. The physics were sound, even if Adler couldn't explain them in scientific language. The proof would come not in gentle May rains, but in conditions so severe that understanding why something worked would matter far less than the fact that it did. By early June, the wagon train had crossed into what is now southeastern Wyoming, following the North Platte River route approximately 40 miles east of Fort Laramie. The landscape had transformed from rolling Kansas prairie to high plains country, with elevation increasing to just over 4,000 feet above sea level. The seasonal temperature patterns in this region during the 1840s were similar to today, with June typically bringing daytime highs in the low 70s and nighttime lows in the mid-40s. What the pioneers didn't know, and couldn't have predicted, was that an unusual weather pattern was forming over the Rocky Mountains to the west. Old-timers at Fort Laramie, mountain men who'd spent decades in the region, later reported they'd seen signs. Elk moving to lower elevations in early June, unusually aggressive behavior from black bears protecting dens, and a ring around the sun on June 8th that the Lakota interpreted as a warning of bitter cold to come. On June 10th, the wagon train captain, a veteran named Samuel Hastings, ordered the train to circle at a location called Bitter Creek, a tributary stream with adequate water and grazing. Several families suggested pushing on, as they were making good time and wanted to cross South Pass before the summer heat intensified. Hastings refused, citing bad feeling in his bones and the advice of a Shoshone trading party they'd encountered 2 days earlier. That decision, reluctant and based more on superstition than science, would save 31 lives. The families prepared as they always did, securing wagons, collecting firewood, and setting up their standard canvas shelters. Adler assembled his double-layer structure with practiced efficiency, completing the setup in 38 minutes, while his children gathered sagebrush and buffalo chips for fuel. The temperature on the evening of June 11, 1847, was 63 degrees Fahrenheit at sunset. By midnight, it had dropped to 38 degrees. By 4 a.m. on June 12th, it had plummeted to 22 degrees, a temperature drop of 41 degrees in less than 10 hours. This wasn't just unusual for June. It was meteorologically extreme, the result of a massive cold air mass pushing down from Canada and colliding with moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. At dawn, the wagon train woke to 2 inches of ice, coating every surface, with freezing rain falling steadily from a sky the colour of old pewter. The wind, which had been calm the previous evening, now gusted to 38 miles per hour from the northwest, a brutal combination that created a wind chill factor equivalent to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Adler's double-layer shelter, The initial temperature at first light was 59 degrees, maintained with the residual heat from the previous night's fire and the insulation provided by the air gap between canvas layers. Adler rekindled his iron stove using dry tinder he'd kept stored in a watertight box, adding buffalo chips gradually to build heat without creating smoke that would choke the enclosed space. Within 40 minutes, the interior temperature reached 66 degrees. His wife Martha prepared a hot breakfast of cornmeal mush, while the children dressed in their warmest clothing, none of them aware that the temperature would continue dropping throughout the day. In the Morrison camp 98 feet away, the situation was drastically different. Their single-layer canvas, draped over the wagon and staked on the windward side, flapped violently despite being weighted with rocks. The interior temperature hovered at 34 degrees, just barely above freezing. Jacob Morrison had built up their fire to a roar, burning through 12 pounds of firewood in 2 hours just to keep the space marginally habitable. His wife Sarah wrapped the children in every blanket they owned, but the cold penetrated regardless, seeping through the porous canvas and stealing warmth faster than the fire could generate it. As June 12th progressed, conditions deteriorated beyond anything the wagon train had experienced. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees with ice accumulating at a rate of 1/4 inch per hour. The freezing rain transitioned to sleet, then to snow, mixed with ice pellets that rattled against canvas and wagon covers like handfuls of thrown gravel. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The wind shifted to come directly from the north, gusting now to 42 miles per hour, and the combination of precipitation, wind, and temperature created what modern meteorologists would classify as a severe ice storm with blizzard characteristics. Families in traditional shelters faced an impossible choice: burn through their limited fuel supplies trying to maintain survivable temperatures, or ration fuel and risk hypothermia. The Breckenridge family, 112 feet from Adler's position, had already consumed 31 pounds of wood by early afternoon, nearly a third of their total supply for what should have been 2 weeks of travel. Thomas Breckenridge's hands were blistered from constant fire tending, and despite his efforts, the interior of their shelter measured 41 degrees, cold enough that his youngest daughter, age 4, was showing early signs of hypothermia, lethargy, slurred speech, and uncontrollable shivering. Inside Adler's shelter, the temperature remained at a steady 64 to 67 degrees throughout the day. The double-layer design was performing exactly as he'd calculated. The outer canvas bore the full brunt of the wind and ice, flexing and rippling under the assault, but holding firm thanks to the brass grommets and reinforced edges. The 9-inch air gap between layers prevented the cold from conducting inward, and the still air trapped in that space acted as an insulator far more effective than any amount of single-layer canvas could be. Adler burned a total of 7 pounds of fuel across the entire 12-hour period, from dawn to dusk, maintaining comfortable warmth, while families around him exhausted their supplies in a losing battle against the elements. By evening on June 12th, the crisis had become acute. 3 families had completely run out of fuel: the Chen family, the Petersons, and a young couple named the Ashfords, huddled in their wagons with no source of heat, watching their breath fog in the freezing air and feeling the cold creep into their bones. Thomas Breckenridge, swallowing his pride and his previous mockery, walked through the ice storm to Adler's shelter. The moment he lifted the inner canvas flap and stepped into the space between the 2 layers, he felt the difference. The outer chamber, that 9-inch gap between canvas walls, was cold but completely still. No wind, no precipitation. When he pushed through the inner flap into the living area, the warmth hit him like a physical force. 65 degrees. A small fire burning in the iron stove. Martha Adler cooking stew. The 3 Adler children playing with wooden toys. Completely comfortable. Completely unaware that 3 dozen people within 200 feet were suffering in life-threatening cold. Breckenridge later described the moment in his journal, an entry discovered by historians in 1923. I stepped from hell into heaven in the span of 2 canvas walls. The German's full tent was the only wisdom in all of Bitter Creek. He asked Adler directly, no preamble, no apology yet. How much fuel are you burning? Adler showed him the neat pile of buffalo chips in the corner, pointing out that he'd used approximately 7 pounds since dawn and had enough for 3 more days at the current rate. Breckenridge had burned 43 pounds in the same period and had perhaps 2 days of fuel remaining, if the storm continued. The mathematics of survival were brutally clear. Adler's shelter was operating at 16% of the fuel consumption rate of traditional setups, while maintaining temperature 30 degrees warmer. That wasn't marginal improvement. That was the difference between survival and death. What happened next became the defining moment of Heinrich Adler's life and legacy. Breckenridge asked if his family could shelter with the Adlers. Before Adler could answer, Jacob Morrison arrived with the same request. Then came Samuel Chen, carrying his hypothermic daughter, followed by the Petersons, the Ashfords, the Hastings family, and more. Within 30 minutes, representatives from 17 families stood in the ice storm outside Adler's double-layer shelter, asking in various degrees of humility and desperation for help. Adler didn't lecture them. He didn't mention their mockery or their ridicule. He simply nodded and began organizing. The shelter that had been built for his family of 5 would now house portions of 18 families through the worst of the storm. He instructed the men to begin dismantling their traditional tent setups and bringing the canvas to his location. Using rope and stakes from multiple family supplies, working through the night of June 12th in brutal conditions, Adler directed the construction of an expanded shelter system. They created 3 connected structures, each using his double-layer principle, arranged in a formation that shared walls and concentrated body heat. The work was exhausting. Hands went numb. Ice formed on beards and eyelashes, but they persevered because the alternative was watching their children freeze. By dawn on June 13th, they had completed what amounted to a frontier refugee camp. 3 double-layer canvas structures housing 18 families, totaling 63 people, keeping them alive with communal fires that burned a combined total of 19 pounds of fuel per hour across all 3 structures. If those same families had remained in their individual traditional shelters, they would have consumed an estimated 68 pounds per hour and still maintained lower temperatures. The storm continued through June 13th and 14th. 73 hours of unrelenting ice, wind, and cold. The lowest recorded temperature during this period was 14 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of June 14th, with wind chill calculations suggesting effective temperatures near 0. When the storm finally broke on the afternoon of June 14th, and the sun emerged for the first time in 3 days, the wagon train took stock. 0 casualties in their camp. 17 families alive, because a German sailmaker had understood that trapped air insulates, and because he'd had the courage to build something everyone called foolish. The aftermath was profound and immediate. News of other wagon trains wasn't encouraging. A party travelling 3 days ahead on the same route had lost 9 people to hypothermia, including 4 children. Another train attempting to shelter at a location 40 miles west had lost 8 pioneers when their traditional canvas shelters proved inadequate, and they'd attempted to huddle in wagons that became ice-locked death traps. The total death toll from the June 1847 ice storm across all wagon trains on the Oregon Trail that year was 41 people, a tragedy documented in multiple pioneer journals and in the records at Fort Laramie. The Donna Reed train's survival rate of 100% was directly attributable to Adler's shelter design and his willingness to share it. Within a week, 12 families had approached Adler, asking him to teach them how to construct double-layer shelters. He spent 3 full days at their next long camp, providing instruction, helping families measure and cut their canvas, explaining the critical importance of the 9-inch air gap, demonstrating proper staking techniques. Thomas Breckenridge became Adler's most devoted student and advocate, telling everyone at Fort Laramie when they arrived on June 29th that the German saved us all, and anyone heading west better learn his methods or they're fools. By the summer of 1848, the double-layer shelter technique had spread throughout the Oregon Trail community. Wagon train outfitters in Independence began selling pre-cut canvas kits based on Adler's specifications, marketed as Adler's German Method shelters. The design became standard equipment for any train expecting to cross the high plains between May and September, months when unexpected cold could still strike, despite the calendar suggesting otherwise. Heinrich Adler himself never sought profit or fame from his innovation. He completed the journey to Oregon, settling in the Willamette Valley, where he established a successful farm and, eventually, a sail-making business serving the Columbia River shipping trade. He built his family's permanent home using the same insulation principles he'd pioneered on the trail: double-wall construction with a 6-inch air gap filled with sawdust, a design so effective that the house remained comfortable through Oregon winters with minimal firewood consumption. That home still stood as of 1921, when it was photographed for the Oregon Historical Society archives, 74 years after its construction. The original double-layer shelter that saved 18 families at Bitter Creek was used by the Adler family for 3 more years during seasonal hunting and logging trips. It eventually became too worn for field use and was donated to the Oregon Pioneer Museum in 1867, where it was displayed for decades as an example of frontier ingenuity. The shelter survived in the museum's collection until a fire in 1889 destroyed much of the building, but detailed measurements and descriptions had been recorded, preserving the exact specifications that had made the design so effective. The technique itself became absorbed into general frontier knowledge, one of hundreds of small innovations that collectively enabled westward expansion. By the 1860s, the principle of insulated shelter through air gaps was being applied to permanent homestead construction across the Plains states, though few builders remembered or acknowledged that a German sailmaker on a wagon train had been among the first to systematically apply the concept to portable shelter in extreme conditions. The story of Heinrich Adler's double-layer shelter carries forward through time, connecting that brutal June storm in 1847 to the fundamental human capacity for observation, innovation, and adaptation. Here was a man who took knowledge from one domain and applied it to another, who faced ridicule for thinking differently, but persisted because he'd learned that physics doesn't respect tradition. The mockery he endured wasn't mere meanness. It was the natural human resistance to change, the deep-seated belief that if something hasn't been done before, it probably shouldn't be done now. Every pioneer in that wagon train had compelling reasons to reject Adler's design. It used more canvas, it weighed more, It took longer to set up. It looked strange. And most damningly, it wasn't how things had always been done. The fact that it might save their lives was theoretical until it actually did. And by then, the lesson had been learned the hardest possible way. What transforms this from a simple survival story into something more profound is the recognition that Adler's innovation didn't require advanced education or exotic materials. He used canvas and rope and wooden stakes, items every family already carried. The difference was how he arranged them, and that difference came from careful observation of patterns in a completely different environment. He'd watched sailors survive North Atlantic crossings. He'd noticed which techniques worked and which failed. He'd asked himself why, and when he found himself facing a different kind of cold on a different kind of journey, he remembered, and he adapted. This is the essence of frontier ingenuity, not invention from nothing, but intelligent application of proven principles to new challenges. The lesson extends beyond shelter construction to the broader question of how communities accept or reject innovation. The wagon train pioneers at Bitter Creek weren't stupid or stubborn by nature. They were people operating with limited resources in life or death circumstances, and in that environment, proven methods feel safer than experiments. The psychological burden of choosing an untested technique and being wrong is enormous when the stakes are your family's survival. This is why innovation often comes from outsiders, people like Adler, who brought experience from different contexts and weren't as invested in existing social norms. He could risk being wrong because he'd already proven himself in a different domain, and he had confidence that his observations were sound. The pioneers who mocked him weren't being malicious. They were being cautious in the only way they knew how. The storm forced a reckoning with that caution, demonstrating that sometimes the safest choice is actually the one that seems riskiest, because it's unfamiliar. In modern terms, we might talk about disruption or innovation, but on the frontier, it was simpler. Someone had a better idea, circumstances proved it, and survival depended on setting pride aside and accepting reality. The fact that 17 families were willing to swallow their ridicule and ask for help shows the fundamental pragmatism that defined successful pioneers. They could adapt when they had to, even if adapting meant admitting they'd been wrong. The human element of this story, the moment when Thomas Breckenridge stepped through those canvas layers from freezing misery into comfortable warmth, represents something universal about the validation of knowledge. Adler had been right all along, but being right didn't matter until others could experience the rightness themselves. All his explanations about air gaps and insulation had been abstract concepts until that moment, when Breckenridge felt 65-degree air on his frozen skin and understood instantly what no amount of description could have conveyed. This is the challenge of all innovation, not just being right, but proving it in ways that overcome both skepticism and the inertia of tradition. Adler achieved that proof not through argument, but through results. And the results were so dramatic, so undeniable, that the entire community shifted their understanding within hours. From mockery to adoption, from the fool's house of sheets to the only wisdom in all of Bitter Creek, the transformation was complete. That such a shift could happen so quickly speaks to the frontier community's ultimate pragmatism, their recognition that survival trumped ego, and their willingness to learn from whoever had knowledge worth learning. If you've found value in this story of frontier innovation and survival, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. These narratives of practical ingenuity from America's pioneer era deserve to be preserved and honoured, and your engagement ensures these lessons continue to reach people who appreciate the problem-solving brilliance that built this nation through impossible challenges. If you know of similar stories from your own family history or regional lore, please share them in the comments below. The collective wisdom of frontier America is vast, and every story adds to our understanding of how ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things with limited resources and unlimited determination. Your support helps keep these histories alive for future generations who need to understand that innovation isn't always about technology or education. Sometimes it's about observation, adaptation, and the courage to do things differently, even when everyone else says you're wrong. The final measure of Heinrich Adler's legacy isn't found in any single number or achievement, but in the quiet multiplication of his idea across thousands of homesteads and camps throughout the American frontier. That 9-inch gap between canvas layers, that precise measurement that created dead airspace and trapped warmth, became incorporated into the collective knowledge that pioneers passed down to children and neighbors. The principle that still air insulates, that layering creates efficiency, that observation from one domain can solve problems in another. These lessons radiated outward from Bitter Creek through every conversation, every demonstration, every family that built their own version of Adler's shelter and survived conditions that would have killed them otherwise. The German sailmaker, who was mocked for wasting canvas, became, without ever seeking it, a permanent fixture in the technical heritage of American westward expansion. His name appears in a dozen pioneer journals, housed in historical societies across Oregon, Wyoming, and Idaho, always in the context of survival, always with respect, often with the admission that the writer had initially doubted him and been proven wrong. Those 63 people who spent 3 days in his expanded shelter system at Bitter Creek told their own stories, and their children told those stories, and the multiplication of testimony created a legacy more durable than any monument. What Heinrich Adler proved in June of 1847 was that the difference between comfort and suffering, between survival and death, can come down to 9 inches of trapped air and the willingness to trust observation over tradition. That lesson, learned through ice and wind and desperate cold, echoes forward through every innovation that saves lives, by doing things differently than they've always been done.